My name is Olivia Bennett, and I've learned that abandonment doesn't always announce itself with slamming doors or raised voices. Sometimes it comes in muted tones and careful lies. At 15, I stood frozen in my Grandpa William's driveway, watching my parents' Mercedes disappear around the corner. The weight of my hastily packed suitcase, nothing compared to the crushing realization that I wasn't valuable enough to keep to myself. "We'll send for you as soon as we're settled in London," my mother said, her manicured hand fleetingly touching my cheek, her eyes already focused somewhere beyond me. It was the same detached efficiency with which she donated outdated furniture to charity. Necessary items suddenly deemed inconvenient, discarded with practiced politeness. I didn't cry then. Tears would come later in the darkness of my grandfather's guest room, but in that moment, I felt only the emptiness of finally realizing the truth I had suspected all my life. In my parents' carefully selected world of investment portfolios and country club memberships, I had always been their least valuable asset, the one they could liquidate when the market turned against them. Have you ever realized that your entire life has been built on a carefully maintained illusion? That behind the picture-perfect family was a very different reality? Growing up in suburban Connecticut, I seemed to have the perfect life. My father James worked as an investment banker. My mother Diane called herself an interior designer, though she spent more time shopping than working with clients. Our colonial-style home, with its immaculately mowed lawn and seasonally changing porch decorations, was often featured in local lifestyle magazines. My parents knew how to create the right impression. Early childhood contained moments of seeming connection. I spun around in my dad's office chair during weekend visits. Occasionally, my mom baked cookies for school events. Dad carried me on his shoulders in the Independence Day parade. Mom threw extravagant birthday parties that impressed her friends more than me. But the warning signs were always present. My first memory of parenthood was my father's reaction to my friendship with Lily, the daughter of the school janitor. I was 7, and I invited her to a play date. My parents didn't say no directly, but after she left, they had a talk with me about the importance of making the right connections and socializing with people in our circle. I was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel shame. Their materialistic values were evident in everything from comments about other people's clothes to dislike of less wealthy relatives. My Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, taught public school and lived in a modest apartment. During rare family gatherings, my parents barely concealed their condescension, always finding a way to mention their recent trip or expensive purchase. "Poor Carol," my mother whispered as my aunt walked away. She could have accomplished so much if only she had made the effort. I remember the confusion on Auntie's face when I received diamond earrings for my 12th birthday. "The first real jewelry for our little princess," as Mom announced. Aunt Carol gave me a collection of classic books with personal notes about each story. Guess which gift I still have to this day? The carefully maintained facade of family life crumbled during the financial crisis of 2008. Dad's risky investments failed catastrophically. First, there were the quiet phone conversations behind closed doors, then the constantly tense shoulders and fake smiles in public. But at home, the masks were falling off. Growing debts led to increasingly violent quarrels. Mom accused Dad of incompetence. He accused her of overspending. Both seemed oblivious to my existence, except when they needed an object for their frustration. "Do you know how much your private school costs?" Dad snapped at me once when I asked for money for a school field trip. "We can't afford the extra expense right now." This was the same man who, a week later, bought new Cartier cufflinks because image is important in business. I became a ghost in my own home, carefully calculating my movements so as not to provoke their anger or witness their quarrels. I learned to become invisible, a useful skill when your presence is just a reminder of financial obligations. The end seemed near, but the shape it took still took me by surprise. The day that forever divided my life into before and after began normally. School, homework, trying to concentrate despite a sleepless night due to a particularly loud parental scandal. I stayed late at the library until closing time, putting off going home. When I finally returned, there were suitcases standing in the hallway. Not just travel bags, big suitcases for long absences. My parents were in a strange, manic state of energy that I hadn't seen from them before. "Ah, there you are!" Mom exclaimed with unnatural animation. "We were just about to call you." I remember standing there, still in my school uniform, trying to make sense of what was happening. Somehow, I already knew my life was changing forever. "We have amazing news," my father continued, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "An opportunity has arisen in London, business contacts that could change everything for us." They'd decided to start all over again in Europe, but their plans didn't include me. I was to stay with my grandfather until they settled down enough to send for me. A promise I recognized even then as a lie by their careful avoidance of eye contact. "We're flying out tonight," Mom said, as she threw the last of her things into a designer bag. "Pack the essentials. We're going to Grandpa's right now." I stood there, stunned not so much by their decision, but by how quickly, how easily they had cut me out of their lives. There was no discussion, no preparation, not even feigned sadness, just the cold pragmatism of people dropping ballast to save a sinking ship. "And school?" I asked, clinging to the practical details because the emotional reality was too hard to comprehend. "We worked it out." My father brushed it off as if my education, my friends, my whole life was just an inconvenient detail. "Your grandfather will take care of the transfer." In 20 minutes, I had packed one suitcase and a backpack. What do you take with you when you're thrown out of your life? I remember standing in my room, trying to decide what was really important. Photo albums? Clothes? Textbooks? I ended up taking a few books donated by Aunt Carol, some clothes, and the little teddy bear my grandfather gave me when I was 5. The trip to Grandpa William's house passed in oppressive silence. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of my parents in the rearview mirror, not regret, but rather impatience, a desire to get this unpleasant task over with as soon as possible. My grandfather lived in a beautiful old mansion in New England. As a child, I loved to visit him, but in recent years, visits had become infrequent. My parents always found excuses to cut down on the time spent there. Now I understand why. Grandpa saw right through them. When we pulled up, he was already standing on the porch. A tall, slender man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. My heart calmed a little at the sight of him. If there was anyone I loved unconditionally, it was Grandpa William. Grandpa opened the door and saw his son and daughter-in-law unloading his daughter like an unwanted pet. He instantly recognized the rejection for what it was, cutting through their excuses about temporary measures and difficult decisions. "So you're abandoning your daughter on my doorstep," he said, not a question but a statement. His voice was quiet but steely. "Dad, don't be dramatic." The father rolled his eyes. "It's only temporary. A few months, a year at the most." "Of course, William," Mom interjected with fake warmth. "We just need your help while we get settled in. You know how hard it is to get everything organized at once in a new country." Grandpa looked at them with a long, appraising stare, then shifted his eyes to me. What he saw in my face seemed to make the decision for him. "Olivia is always welcome in my home," he said simply, opening his arms to me. It was the moment something in me broke. I collapsed into his arms, feeling the first genuine comfort I'd felt in months. His arms were strong and secure, his heartbeat steady and sure against my ear. My parents left quickly after that, with perfunctory goodbyes and promises to call. I stood in the driveway, watching their car disappear, feeling my life disappear with it. That was the last time I'd seen them for 12 years. "Let's go inside, honey," Grandpa said softly, his hand on my shoulder. "It's getting cold." I let him take me into the house, each step feeling like a step into an unknown future. Grandpa showed me to the room he'd prepared, not the usual guest room, but one specially set up for me, with bookshelves and a desk by the window overlooking the garden. "I thought you might like some natural light for reading," he said, pointing to the desk. Such a small detail, but it spoke of so much, that he remembered my love of reading, that he had thought of my comfort, that he had anticipated and prepared for my arrival long before my parents made their sudden decision. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, my voice barely audible. "You must be tired," he said. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." That night, in the darkness of the guest room that was now my room, the tears finally came. I cried for my lost life, for my parents who could so easily give up on me, for how easy it was to be left behind. But a thin thread of comfort ran through the pain, the memory of my grandfather's strong embrace, the knowledge that at least one person in the world saw me, really saw me, and didn't find me missing. I didn't know then that the day that seemed like the end of my life was actually the beginning, that the home I felt abandoned in would be the place where I would finally find the true meaning of family, that the man who opened his arms when I needed it most would teach me that true family bonds are not created by blood, but by presence, care, and unconditional love. But those lessons were yet to come. That night, I was just a 15-year-old girl, lost and abandoned, unaware that my salvation had already begun. Do you know how much of an impact a person can have on your life by their mere presence, without loud words or promises? My grandfather William was the anchor that kept me afloat when my life turned into a storm of uncertainty and betrayal. William Bennett was the exact opposite of my parents, a self-sufficient technology entrepreneur who valued substance and character over external gloss. He lived in a spacious New England mansion filled with books he actually read and art he genuinely appreciated, not status symbols purchased to impress others. In the first few days after my parents' departure, I felt as if I were numb with pain. I mechanically moved around the house, performed basic activities, but inside I was completely empty. The surrounding world seemed unreal, blurred, as if I was looking at it through thick glass. Many adults in this situation would try to fill the silence with awkward consolations or forced conversations. "It'll be okay. They'll come back for you. Time heals." Grandpa did things differently. He never forced me to talk or offered empty reassurances. Instead, he maintained a steady, caring presence, making sure food showed up regularly, providing everything I needed for school, and making it clear that his house was my home for as long as I wanted it to be. "I'm not going to tell you that I understand what you're going through, Olivia," he said one evening as I sat staring out the window. "But I want you to know that I'm here, not just today or tomorrow, but every day you need me." This quiet constancy was in stark contrast to the occasional calls from my parents, which were brief and unsatisfying, always with excuses about how they were just about to go to dinner with potential investors, or just heading out to look at a prospective apartment. The conversations would end with vague promises that they would work out the details of my move soon. After each such call, Grandpa would find a way to distract me, with a walk in the garden, a new book, or just a quiet presence around me. He never criticized my parents in my presence, but his eyes said all I needed to know about his opinion of what they were doing. As months turned into years without visits materializing, and the time frame for reunification stretched from a few months to a vague someday, my grandfather and I developed healing routines that brought structure and joy to my life. Saturday mornings we spent in his gorgeous gardens, where he taught me plant names and patience. "Gardens and people are alike, Livy," he would say, using an affectionate abbreviation of my name that no one but him used. "They need constant care, but you can't make them grow faster than their natural rhythm. All in good time." We often spent evenings watching the stars on the terrace. Grandpa would set up his old telescope, and we would study the night sky. He connected constellations to mythology and life wisdom, turning ordinary stargazing into a lesson about human nature and overcoming challenges. "See Perseus?" he once asked, pointing to a group of stars. The Greeks believed he saved Andromeda from a sea monster, but what's interesting is that he needed help: Athena's shield, Hermes' sandals. It reminds us that even heroes don't do it alone. Accepting help is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom. Countless hours we spent in his library, where he noticed which books I was drawn to and thoughtfully expanded my literary horizons. If I was reading Jane Austen, he might suggest Bronte or Eliot. If I showed an interest in history, he found not dry textbooks, but living memoirs and personal accounts of those who had witnessed great events. When my 16th birthday came, it had been almost a year since my temporary stay with my grandfather. There was only a brief, generic email from my parents. "Happy birthday, dear. We hope you are doing well. We are so busy with a new project, but thinking of you. Love, Mom and Dad." Grandpa, on the other hand, turned the day into a real treat. He surprised me with driving lessons and eventually my own car because independence is too important to put off. Another philosophical difference with my controlling parents. "Your life is your life, Olivia," he said, handing me the keys to a used but reliable Volvo. "I trust your judgment and your decisions. You deserve the tools to build the life you want." My 17th birthday brought another shared email from my parents and another meaningful gift from my grandfather, an antique desk for my room, restored by his own hands. "I noticed you've started writing," he said, running his hand over the smooth surface of the wood. "Every writer deserves a decent place to create." These weren't just gifts. They were an investment in me as a person, a recognition of my interests, my needs, my future. Unlike my parents, who saw me as an extension of themselves, my grandfather saw me as a separate person with my own dreams and potential. By my senior year of high school, I had built a new life with friends who knew my story and accepted me anyway, teachers who saw my potential, and most importantly, a grandfather who showed me daily what unconditional love looked like in action, not empty words. Most of all, it showed in the little things. The way he memorized my favorite meals and prepared them on tough days. The way he noticed when I was depressed and found tactful ways to lift my spirits. The way he stood up for me to school administrators when questions arose about my family situation. "Olivia lives with me on a full-time basis," he told the principal firmly when he started asking questions about parental signatures on a school field trip. "I am her legal guardian, and all questions can be directed to me." I didn't know then that the phrase legal guardian had a deeper meaning than I realized. It was something I would discover much later. When it came time to apply to college, Grandpa was there for me every step of the way, helping me research schools, editing my essays, calming my doubts. He was the one who noticed my interest in law and justice and encouraged me to apply to pre-law programs. "You have a sharp mind and a strong sense of justice, Livy," he said. "You'll be a great lawyer if that's what you want to do." When the college acceptance letters arrived, including one from a top-tier university with an excellent pre-law program, Grandpa danced with me in the kitchen to celebrate, proudly displaying the acceptance letter on the refrigerator as a parent would, because in every way that mattered, that's who he was. In that moment, I realized a fundamental truth about family that my parents had never understood. Family isn't just shared DNA or legal bonds. It's a choice to be there for each other, a choice to see a person for who they are, a choice to put someone else's needs on par with your own, and sometimes above. "Olivia," Grandpa said that evening as we sat on the patio, enjoying a quiet celebration of my admission, "I want you to know something." I turned to him, his face softly lit by the sunset light. "Yes, Grandpa?" "When your parents brought you here, they thought they were leaving a burden behind, but they were wrong. You were never a burden. You were a gift. These years with you, they've given me purpose and joy and companionship when I thought I'd spend the rest of my days alone. So thank you." His words touched something deep inside me. The idea that I was not just the recipient of his kindness, but that our relationship was truly mutual, that I also brought value to his life. In that moment, I realized that despite the painful beginning, I had gained something precious, a true parent, someone who chose me even when he didn't have to. And that choice, that constant, unwavering presence of my grandfather in my life, taught me the true meaning of family in a way that my parents never could. If this story resonates in your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. In the comments, I would love to hear about your stories of people who became family, not by blood, but by choice. Who was your Grandpa William, the person who showed you what it meant to truly be there for each other? Share your experiences, and let's create a community that understands. True family is defined by love and presence, not just a shared last name. There are moments in life that divide it into before and after, quiet, almost imperceptible twists of fate that change everything. For me, such a moment was an ordinary phone call in my 3rd year of college. "Livy, it's no big deal." Grandpa's voice sounded deceptively carefree. "Just a little indigestion. The doctor insisted I stay overnight for observation." Only later did I learn from his housekeeper Martha that the slight indigestion was actually a heart attack, which Grandpa William at first refused to acknowledge. This was the beginning of a gradual decline in health that changed the dynamics of our relationship in subtle but fundamental ways. I immediately returned home from college, 3 hours away, and spent the next week insisting on doctor visits and dietary changes, which Grandpa accepted with his characteristic patient humor. "Livy," he said, when I replaced his usual breakfast of bacon and eggs with oatmeal with berries, "do you realize that at 72, I've already lived longer than I expected?" I froze, a spoonful of oatmeal hanging in the air. The thought of life without him was an unbearable void I refused to consider. "And I still plan to live to be 100, he continued with a mischievous smile, noticing my expression. "So I guess I'll eat this oatmeal. But tomorrow, I expect at least one piece of bacon." Those days led to many heartfelt conversations, during which Grandpa would often say to me, "I never regretted for a moment that you came to live with me. What your parents considered an inconvenience became the greatest joy of my later years." Those words always brought a lump to my throat. How often I wondered if he considered me a burden, an unexpected responsibility at a time when he should have been enjoying a quiet retirement. Now, listening to the sincerity in his voice, I began to truly believe that perhaps our unexpected living together was a gift to both of us. Despite his deteriorating health, Grandpa insisted on attending my graduation from college. We found a compromise. He agreed to a wheelchair to get around campus in exchange for me not fussing over him during the ceremony. When my name was called and I took the stage, I looked out into the audience and saw my grandfather, who, contrary to our agreement, stood up, applauding with tears in his eyes. The moment brought up complex emotions, joy at his presence, and renewed anger at the absence of my parents, who hadn't even responded to the graduation invitation I'd sent in a last-ditch attempt to connect. Part of me still craved their approval, their presence, even when reason told me I'd long outgrown that need. "I'm so proud of you," Grandpa said later when we were celebrating at his favorite Italian restaurant. He handed me a small blue box. Inside were pearl earrings that once belonged to his mother, my great-grandmother. "She was a smart woman," he said, "the first in the family to get a college education. She would have been happy you got them." I wore those earrings my first week of law school, feeling them like a talisman linking me to a legacy of strength and determination. When I began studying law, my grandfather's health had seriously deteriorated after a minor stroke. This forced me to arrange distance learning so that I could finally return to the mansion, creating another gift of fate, the difficult but precious time together when the roles gradually reversed and I became the caregiver. I remember arguing with my supervisor, who warned that taking a career break to care for an elderly relative could put me at a disadvantage. "Professor Cohen," I said firmly, "he chose me when no one else did. Now it's my turn to choose him." The daily care of my grandfather was both exhausting and deeply meaningful. I organized his medications, coordinated doctor and physical therapy appointments, prepared nutritious meals, and helped with basic tasks that became increasingly difficult for him with each passing month. But the most precious moments occurred on quiet evenings when Grandpa shared stories about his early business difficulties, his marriage to Grandma Eleanor, whom I barely remembered, his complicated relationship with my father, and lessons learned from mistakes. He was determined that his experiences could guide me after he was gone. "Your father," he said one evening, looking out the window at the garden plunged into dusk, "was always looking for the shortest path to success. He never realized that real value is often created in struggle, in overcoming difficulties, not in avoiding them." "Are you mad at him?" I asked, referring not only to the father-son relationship, but also to the way they'd treated me. "For the fact that he left? For leaving me?" Grandpa turned to me, his eyes clear even though his body was weakening. "Anger is a luxury, Livy. It requires energy that I prefer to spend on loving those who deserve it. I'm disappointed in his choice. I hurt for the pain he caused you, but ultimately his decisions led you to me, and for that I cannot be sorry." I thought about this approach to life, about focusing on gratitude for what we have instead of bitterness for what we don't have. It was one of the many lessons Grandpa discreetly taught me. The end came on a peacefully clear autumn morning when I read one of his favorite books to Grandpa, Evelyn Waugh's Return to Brideshead. His hand relaxed in mine as he exhaled one last time, so quietly that I continued reading for a few sentences before I realized he was gone. Strangely, I didn't feel shock or denial. There was a deep sadness, yes, but also a strange sense of completeness, of completion. We had used all of our time together, leaving nothing untold or undone. I held his hand long after I realized he was gone, tears flowing silently down my face as I thanked him for all he had given me. The days that followed passed in a haze of funeral preparations, which I handled with the help of Elijah Thompson, Grandpa's longtime attorney and trusted friend. I chose flowers, readings, and wrote a eulogy that could never fully convey the greatness of what he meant to me. Elijah, a reserved man with discerning eyes and a calming presence, became my guide through the practical aspects of the loss, from funeral arrangements to initial discussions about Grandpa's will. William organized everything with typical thoroughness, Elijah assured me as I sat in his office the day after the funeral, still stunned by the reality of life without my grandfather. You have nothing to worry about. I nodded, vaguely aware that Grandpa had probably left me something in his will, perhaps some personal items, maybe even a small amount of money. But thoughts of inheritance seemed trivial compared to the vast emptiness of its absence. 3 days after the funeral, Elijah called to schedule a reading of the will, mentioning in a carefully neutral tone that my parents had expressed interest in attending. "Your parents?" I echoed, feeling my stomach clench at the mere mention of them. "Yes," he confirmed. "They contacted me yesterday. I explained that the reading is scheduled for 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon in my office." This news caused a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at their sudden interest now that money might have been involved, but also a pathetic glimmer of hope that they might actually care about their father's passing. I spent a restless night asking myself why now, after 12 years of silence, they had suddenly decided to show up. Was it just greed? Or had my grandfather's death somehow awakened in them a realization of their own mortality? Could it be that deep inside, they felt a prick of regret for tearing our family apart? The answer came the next day when they arrived in a luxury rental car, greeting me with fake enthusiasm, as if we were relatives who had simply lost touch, rather than parents who had abandoned their child. "Olivia, honey!" My mother walked over to me, her arms outstretched as if for a hug that didn't follow. She paused, studying me from head to toe, her eyes noting my simple black suit and great-grandmother's pearl earrings. "You look grown up." My father stood behind her, his attention already roaming the foyer of the mansion, his eyes gliding over the artwork and furniture with ill-concealed calculation, with the look of an appraiser rather than a mourner. "I am an adult," I replied neutrally. "I am 27 years old." Of course, of course." My mother waved her hand as if my age was just a minor detail. "Such a tragedy with your grandfather. We were so shocked when we heard." I stared at her flawlessly painted face, looking for any sign of genuine grief, but saw only a carefully constructed mask of propriety put on for show. "How did you know?" I asked. "I haven't been able to contact you to let you know." My father finally turned his attention to me. "An old friend mentioned it. We booked a flight right away. Family should be together in times like these." Family. That word, spoken by him after 12 years of absence, almost made me laugh at the absurdity of it. "We're staying at the Four Seasons," Mom continued, her eyes still studying the room. "Such a shame we couldn't make it to the funeral. Such a short notice." "The funeral was 4 days ago," I remarked. An awkward pause hung between us as I knew it would. Then my father cleared his throat. "We should probably head over to Elijah's? We don't want to be late." As we headed to my car, I insisted on driving them to Elijah's office, refusing to ride in their rental car. I watched them with the corner of my eye. They hadn't changed much over the years. My mother still impeccably groomed, with a trendy haircut and designer bag. My father still with the same aura of confidence of a man who believes rules exist for others. And yet, something had changed. Now I could see the subtle tension around my mother's eyes, a hint of worry wrinkles that makeup couldn't quite hide. My father, once the imposing figure of my childhood, now seemed smaller, as if life had shrunk him a little. These 12 years had not been kind to them, despite their outward gloss. As we drove in silence through the familiar streets of my childhood, a strange thought struck me. Maybe all this time I had imagined them to be more powerful than they really were. In my mind, they were colossi, making decisions that shaped my destiny. But now, looking at them with adult eyes, I saw just people, flawed, scared, and perhaps beginning to realize the cost of their decisions. But when I noticed my father pulling out his phone to take a picture of a particularly valuable painting in the living room before we left, the illusion of their possible remorse dissipated. They hadn't come to make up or to honor my grandfather's memory. They had come for what they could get. With that bitter realization, I led them to Elijah's office, where we would learn exactly what Grandpa William had left behind, and to whom. Have you ever felt like time slows down at critical moments in your life? Like the universe is giving you the opportunity to capture every detail of a moment that will change your destiny forever? That's exactly how I felt in Elijah's office, sitting across from my parents, who 12 years ago had decided I wasn't worth their time, and now looked at me with poorly concealed impatience. Elijah Thompson's office was the epitome of an old-fashioned law practice dark wood paneling, massive bookcases filled with volumes of law, and a heavy desk where he sat with impeccable posture. My parents were seated across from him, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than reading my father and father-in-law's wills. My mother sat with a perfectly straight back, her pearl necklace and perfectly styled hair screaming of a status I now realized she might no longer have. My father was tapping his fingers on the table, a sign of impatience I remembered from my childhood. "Before we begin," Elijah said, folding his hands on the file folder, "I'd like to offer my condolences to you all. William was not only my client, but a dear friend." My parents nodded in sync, with expressions of grief they'd probably rehearsed in front of the mirror. "Let's cut to the chase," my father interrupted. "We're on a very tight schedule." Elijah gave him a long look, then opened the folder and began to read. "I, William Edward Bennett, being of sound mind and sound judgment, hereby bequeath my entire estate to—" I watched my parents as Elijah read out the standard legal wording. Their postures radiated confidence, but their eyes betrayed concern. They exchanged glances when they thought no one would notice, the small, nervous glances of people who had come to get theirs. "Including all financial assets, real estate, business interests, and personal effects, valued in total at over $11 million, to my granddaughter, Olivia Elizabeth Bennett." My parents exchanged panicked glances. My father leaned forward, his face beginning to redden. "What? What about his son, his own child?" he demanded, slapping his palm on the table. Elijah raised his hand in a calming gesture and continued reading. "Olivia has been not only my granddaughter, but my legally adopted daughter since the year 2010, a status granted by the court after her abandonment by her biological parents, James and Diane Bennett." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. I sat in shock myself, though for a different reason. Grandpa had adopted me? Legally? He never told me that directly. There had been hints, sure, occasional mentions of legal guardianship, documents I'd signed when I was 16, but I'd never realized the full extent of his actions. "This is a slanderous misrepresentation of the facts." My mother was the first to break the silence, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the red blotches streaking down her neck. "We never gave up our parental rights. It was a temporary agreement." "We've maintained parental rights all along," his father echoed, his voice rising an octave. Elijah maintained the perfect calm that only comes with decades of practicing law. He methodically pulled out a folder of documents and began laying them out in front of him. "In that case, you might want to refresh your memory on some of the details," he said, handing the first document to my father. "Here's a registered mail receipt, signed by Mrs. Bennett, acknowledging receipt of the adoption summons." Mom turned pale as she looked at her signature on the yellow piece of paper. "And here's a printout of the email correspondence," Elijah continued, handing over the next document, where Mr. Bennett writes, and I quote, "Do as you see fit. We trust your judgment in response to William's intention to seek legal adoption." My father scrutinized the printout like it was a poisonous snake. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to find a way out of a situation he himself had created 12 years ago with one careless email. "Even so," he said, changing tactics so quickly that I almost admired his adaptability. Any inheritance Olivia receives should be managed by her biological parents until she reaches a more mature age. We have the right to... I'm 27 years old and in my second year of law school, I finally uttered, my own rage boiling beneath the surface. I'm more than capable of managing my own affairs. The law recognizes that your legal rights ceased when you didn't challenge the adoption. My mother looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps she had. The little girl they'd left on my grandfather's doorstep had disappeared years ago. In her place sat a woman who knew her rights and wasn't afraid to stand up for them. Olivia, sweetheart. Her voice became sweet, pleading. You have to understand that we always wanted the best for you. It was a hard time for all of us. We thought we were doing the right thing. Sending one email in 12 years? I asked, surprised at my own calmness. Not responding to graduation invitations? Not showing up at the funeral of the man who raised your daughter? My father, apparently deciding that my mother's sweet speeches weren't working, reverted to aggressive tactics. This is unacceptable. We will contest this will. William was obviously out of his mind if he thought he could disinherit his own son. You are free to try, Elijah replied calmly. However, I should point out that the will was drafted and signed 4 years before William's first mini-stroke, with 2 independent witnesses and a medical evaluation of his cognitive abilities, which is standard practice in my firm for all clients over the age of 65. My parents left Elijah's office with poorly concealed rage, promising to contact their attorneys. I was left, numbed by the revelation of my adoption, and shocked by my parents' continued ability to think only of themselves, even in the face of death. He was going to tell you, Elijah said quietly when we were alone. About the adoption. He was worried you might misunderstand his motives, think he was only doing it for the inheritance, not out of love. Why didn't he ever tell me? At first, he wanted to protect you legally, in case your parents suddenly decided to come back and take you away. Then, I think he just didn't want to be reminded of the pain they caused. He hoped you'd never know how little they fought for you. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. Even in this, Grandpa was trying to protect me. Over the next few weeks, it became clear that my parents weren't going to give up without a fight. Unable to accept defeat despite the overwhelming evidence against them, they hired an aggressive attorney known for involvement in contentious inheritance cases and began a campaign to discredit me. First, it was anonymous tip-offs to local journalists, alleging that I had manipulated my elderly grandfather as his guardian. Then, they set up a temporary residence at a local hotel, posing as caring family members who swooped in to make sure their father received proper care. When that didn't work, they filed a formal petition to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. Suddenly, I found myself embroiled in a lawsuit against my own parents, fighting for an inheritance I had never asked for, but that my grandfather had so carefully secured for me. They're making a big mistake, Elijah said during one of our strategy meetings. William was a very thorough man. He foresaw the possibility of this scenario. And indeed, devastating evidence against my parents emerged from the disclosure process. Every request for money they had made over the years was preserved with dates and amounts. Thousands of dollars sent to London for business expenses, temporary financial difficulties, and investment opportunities. Their signed consent to grandfather's guardianship was notarized. Court records of the adoption included their failure to appear at several hearings despite proper notice. And perhaps most devastating was that financial disclosures showed they were essentially bankrupt. Despite the designer clothes and luxury rental car, their desperate need for grandfather's money was obvious. During the last court hearing, as my parents' attorney presented closing arguments, I watched them across the courtroom. They looked smaller than when they arrived. My father's suit, once a perfect fit, now seemed too big, and my mother's flawless makeup couldn't hide the lines of tension around her eyes. At that moment, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, not triumph or gloating, as I might have expected, but something akin to pity. Not compassion, they didn't deserve it, but a realization of how empty their lives had been. They had lost their daughter, turned their backs on their father, and now sat in the courtroom, desperately clinging to the last hope of a financial salvation they knew was not theirs. As the judge read his decision, upholding my grandfather's will and rejecting all of my parents' claims, I felt no joy. Only a quiet affirmation that Grandpa, even after his death, still protected me. That his love and care extended so far ahead that he had anticipated this very moment and prepared for it with typical thoroughness. "This was his last gift to you," Elijah said as we left the courtroom. "Not just money or property, but freedom from people who only see you for what you can give them." I nodded, realizing the wisdom of his words. My inheritance wasn't just material. It was a legacy of strength, care, and protection that my grandfather had built for me over the years. A lesson that true family is those who stick around when it's hard, not those who only show up when it benefits them. When I walked out of the courthouse, there are moments that are forever imprinted in our memories, crystal clear snapshots of time that stay with us despite the years. For me, such a moment was my father's face after the judge issued a final ruling in my favor, stating, "The adoption of Olivia Bennett was legally established and never challenged within the appropriate time frame." My parents' reaction was immediate and dramatic. My mother broke into theatrical sobs, holding a designer handkerchief to her eyes without a single tear, while my father stood pointing a trembling finger at me and shouting, "You ungrateful little thief!" His face contorted with rage, exposing a man I'd never truly known, the one who hid behind the mask of successful banker and caring father he'd worn during my childhood. Elijah gently placed a hand on my shoulder and led me out of the courtroom while the bailiffs restrained my father. "Don't let them cloud your victory," he said quietly. But it wasn't about victory. I felt no triumph, only a deep, pervasive weariness and a strange release. It was as if the last thread binding me to the people who had given me a life, but not a family, had finally broken. I naively assumed that the court ruling would end the saga, but for my parents, it was only the beginning. Despite winning in court, they began a campaign of harassment, endless phone calls, first pleading, then threatening, surprise appearances at campus events where they tried to accidentally bump into me, anxious visits to the mansion that forced me to install a new security system. Their persistence culminated about 2 months after the court order. I came home after a long day of classes and found them sitting in my living room, sipping tea from Grandpa's favorite tea service. They had convinced the new housekeeper that they were expected guests, taking advantage of her ignorance of our history. "Olivia, darling, you're finally home," my mother said, as if this was a normal family reunion and not a blatant violation. I froze in the doorway, feeling panic and anger struggle inside me. This was my home, my safe place, and they had invaded it as unceremoniously as they had once invaded my life, only to turn it upside down again. "You're violating a restraining order," I said, surprised at the calmness in my voice. "I'll call the police." "Don't be so dramatic," my father waved away my threat. "We're your parents. We have the right to—" And something inside me finally broke, not from weakness, but from sudden crystal clarity. I found the strength to speak the truth. 12 years ago, you made a choice. You decided that your comfort, your lifestyle, and your freedom were more important than your child. That was your right as adults, even if it was morally reprehensible. But you have no right to show up 12 years later expecting access to money you didn't earn from a man whose last years you didn't bother to share. My words hung in the air between us, heavy with the truth they were so desperately trying to avoid. "How dare you?" Father began, but I held up my hand, stopping him. "No," I said firmly. "You will no longer tell me what I can or can't do. You gave up that right when you left me on Grandpa's porch. He was my real family, the only real family I've ever had. And I will not allow you to desecrate his memory or his home with your presence." I pulled out my phone and called the police, maintaining eye contact with my parents the entire time. Something in my steadfastness, in the steadfastness of my gaze, made them realize that their tactics wouldn't work this time. They left before the police arrived, but that was the last time they tried to invade my life physically. The restraining order was expanded, and their attorney finally made them realize the seriousness of the consequences of further violations. A year after the court battle ended, I stood on the newly renovated terrace of what was now truly my home, watching guests arrive for the official opening of the William Bennett Foundation. The sun was setting over the gardens my grandfather had loved so much, casting a warm golden light on those gathered: law school professors, community activists, law students, and a few young people who had already received support from the foundation. I had partially converted the mansion into the headquarters of a foundation dedicated to providing scholarships, mentoring, and legal advocacy for young survivors of family abandonment. The East Wing, with its stately library and spacious rooms, was ideal for offices and meetings, while I kept the West Wing as a private space, a perfect balance between preserving Grandpa's legacy and creating something new that embodied his values. "He would be so proud," Elijah said, approaching me with a glass of champagne. Over the past year, he had become not just my legal advisor, but a mentor and friend. "I hope so," I replied, looking around at those gathered. Among them was Maddie, an 18-year-old who had just received our first full scholarship to study social work, a bright, determined young woman whose parents had left her in the foster care system when she was 12. There was Tyler, a quiet 15-year-old boy receiving support from our legal advocates as he navigated the complex system of emancipation from neglectful parents. In their faces, I saw echoes of myself, the same mix of vulnerability and strength, the same determination to create a life not defined by those who had abandoned their responsibilities. In addition to the foundation, I established a small law practice specializing in family law, especially in cases involving abandoned or vulnerable children. My personal story became my strongest asset, allowing me to effectively advocate for those whose voices would otherwise go unheard. I knew what it was like to be a child in a room full of adults making decisions about your life without regard for your wants or needs. I vowed that while I could do something about it, no child would ever feel as invisible. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, as I sat in his, now my, office going through some of his old papers, an unexpected letter arrived from Europe. I immediately recognized my mother's impeccable handwriting on the envelope, and for a moment I thought about just throwing it away without opening it. But something compelled me to read it. Inside was a long, winding letter expressing regret after her own experience of abandonment when my father left her for a younger woman. "I realize now what you've been through," she wrote, "the pain of being abandoned by the one who should have loved you the most." I read the letter twice, searching for the anger or pain that had once been so sharp, but instead of renewed pain, I felt only quiet understanding. Not forgiveness. I'm not sure I could ever truly forgive their choices, but a recognition that their actions had always said more about their own shortcomings than my worth. I simply placed the letter in a folder with the other documentation of my story, not destroying it, but not keeping it close either, representing a chapter finally completed, not an open wound needing attention. Sitting there, in the quiet sanctuary of my grandfather's study, I reflected on the fact that true legacy was never about money or property. It was in the unwavering love that Grandpa showed me, demonstrating through consistent daily actions what family should be, and restoring my ability to trust and connect after a devastating betrayal. He taught me that family is not just about blood or legal ties, but about the choices we make every day. The choice to stay, even when it's hard. The choice to see a person for who they are, not who we want them to be. The choice to put someone else's needs on par with our own, and sometimes above. Looking now at the successes of the foundation, the lives we have helped change, I know that my grandfather gave me so much more than just financial security. He gave me a model of what true love can look like, and in return for that gift, I promise to pass that love on, to create a space where other abandoned children can find support, understanding, and a chance to rewrite their stories like he helped me rewrite mine. That, I think, is the true legacy of a keeper, not in what he leaves us, but in what he allows us to create for ourselves and for others. Not in the material goods, but in the values he instills and the lessons that live on in our actions long after he's gone. And when I look to the future, to the young people whose lives will be touched by the foundation, to the clients I will represent, to the community we are building together, I know that Grandpa is still with me, guiding my decisions, shaping my values, inspiring me to be the best version of myself. That, in the end, is the most precious legacy of all. A love that doesn't end with death, but continues to grow and spread, touching lives we will never know, long after we are gone. That day, I did so not just as an heiress to a fortune, but as a woman who was finally free of the need for approval from those who could never truly see it.